Well, good afternoon, and welcome to yet another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. So, this episode continues along the path of investigating manuscript hunters and collectors. In our last episode, we discussed the Glazier Codex, housed in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. And in this episode, we discuss another famous collector, Charles Lang Freer. We begin at the end of his life. We are zooming in to what is today the Peninsula Hotel in New York City, a luxury residence on the east side near Central Park. And I have a little connection to this hotel in that my wife at one time was a nurse caretaker for an extremely wealthy woman who, with her family, rented the entire penthouse of the peninsula for a week while they shopped at the most exclusive and expensive stores on Fifth Avenue. Their personal driver was sitting idling in the limousine, awaiting their beck and call. But I digress. The peninsula was known as the Gotham Hotel in its earliest days. It was built in 1905 and remains to this day a fabulous place to stay in New York City if you can afford it. If you were to book a room for the first full week of February 2025, Monday through Friday, the cheapest rooms go for $750 a day. They quickly escalate to $4,445 per day for larger and more exclusive rooms, higher floors, and park views. We mention these things because not just any Joe can stay at the Peninsula Hotel, or the Gotham Hotel, as it was called in Freer's day. Charles Lang Freer was no ordinary Joe or ordinary Charles. Charles Lang Freer was born February 25th, 1854, and he was an American industrialist in the rail car business, an art collector, and patron. And what was his connection to the Gotham Hotel? Well, that's where he died, right there in the Gotham Hotel, while in his 66th year from a stroke of apoplexy on September 25th, 1919. Charles Freer never married or had children. He is known for his large art collection of East Asian, American, and Middle Eastern art, and for our focus, biblical manuscripts. And on May 5th, 1906, Charles Lang Freer and the Smithsonian agreed to the donation of his art collection and funds for the building of a museum to house it, making him the first American to bequeath his private collection to the United States government. He charged the government a fee of $1 for the transaction. The gift, for some reason, was initially rejected, but intervention by President Theodore Roosevelt, Freer's personal friend, sealed the deal. And yes, you're looking at the young Roosevelt while at Harvard in 1877. And here's a more dignified picture as president in 1904. Roosevelt said, "It's impossible to speak in too high terms of the munificence shown by Mr. Freer in this offer, and it is one which the government of the United States should at once close as a matter of course. Mr. Freer's collection is literally priceless." So, to house the objects, Freer funded the construction of the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., to the tune of $1 million. It was first opened to the public in 1923. Unfortunately, Freer did not live to see his gallery become a reality. And so today, if you visit the Freer Gallery of Art at the Smithsonian, you will be in the presence of some 9,500 art objects from his collection, not to mention thousands purchased after his death. In 1887, Freer acquired his first works by expatriate American artist James McNeill Whistler. Yes, that Whistler. And here's his mother. His long relationship with Whistler as a patron and collector resulted in the Freer Gallery today having one of the world's most sizable and significant collections of Whistler's work. The Freer Gallery houses a world-renowned collection of art from China, Japan, Korea, South and Southeast Asia, and the Near East. And visitor favorites include Chinese paintings, Japanese folding screens, Korean ceramics, Buddhist sculpture, Indian and Persian art, and biblical manuscripts. So, how did Freer come into such wealth, and what started his passion for collecting art? Well, let's review his early history. He was born in Kingston, New York in 1854. The third child of six, his family had little money. Freer's mother died when he was just 14 years old. And after the seventh grade, he left school and took a job in a cement factory. But in the early 1870s, Freer's accounting and organizational skills were noticed by Frank Hecker, general superintendent of the New York, Kingston, and Syracuse Railroad. He hired young Charles as his paymaster and accountant in 1874. A group of investors from Detroit decided to build a line in Logansport, Indiana, and they hired Hecker to manage the project, and Hecker brought along the young Charles to assist. Freer and Hecker moved to Detroit, where they created the Peninsular Car Company in 1885. It was rail cars, not automobiles. The business made both men extremely wealthy, and Peninsula became Detroit's second largest rail car manufacturer. In 1892, Peninsula merged with the Michigan Car Company, taking over the majority of the rail car market in Detroit. And in 1899, Freer organized a 13 company merger, creating the American Car and Foundry. But all this work took a toll. In the 1890s, Freer's health declined. The economic depression of the 1890s, paired with the stress of Freer's position in the company, caused him both physical and psychological trauma. He was diagnosed with neurasthenia, a nervous condition widespread among the upper class in the United States. Treatment included long periods of rest, and men were encouraged to take activities and pursue vacations in the wilderness. So Freer went into the Canadian wilderness for a time and visited the Catskills. And here's a picture of him in the Catskills relaxing. In addition to travel as therapy, Freer started collecting art in the 1880s. And in 1899, Freer retired at the age of 45 as a multi-millionaire. And he focused his time on traveling and collecting art. During his first visit to Egypt in 1906, Freer was offered a small group of biblical manuscripts, and despite knowing little of their significance, he made the purchase, and his instincts were spot on. He had just purchased one of the world's oldest Greek parchment manuscripts of the Gospels. In subsequent years, he obtained additional parchment and papyrus manuscripts from Egypt written in Greek and Coptic. They're in codex form, folded sheets forming leaves like a modern book, and together these works comprise one of the most important collections of biblical manuscripts outside of Europe. And let's look at his first biblical manuscript purchase in Egypt. So while visiting Cairo in December 1906, he purchased those four Greek parchments from an antiquities dealer in Cairo. And these four included a codex of the four Gospels commonly dated to the 4th or early 5th century, an early 5th century codex containing Deuteronomy and Joshua, an early 5th century codex of the Psalms, and remnants of a highly damaged 6th century codex of the Pauline letters. Certainly, a few decades after Freer's purchase, more and earlier biblical manuscripts came to light, such as J. Pierpont Morgan's purchase of a wealth of Coptic books in 1911, and Chester Beatty's collection of papyri we discussed in our last full episode. Also, the Nag Hammadi finds of the 1940s come to mind, the Bodmer New Testament papyri of the 1950s, that's coming in another episode, and the Qumran discoveries in the 40s and 50s. But at the time of Freer's purchase in 1906, None of these finds, of course, were ever imagined. In 1906, there were four early parchment codices variously dated between the mid 4th and 6th centuries. And these four were Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Bezae, Codex Vaticanus, and Sinaiticus. It is in this light that we have to understand their significance of Freer's purchase. Any one of his manuscripts would have been a significant addition and created scholarly excitement. But to have four manuscripts of such antiquity announced together was, well, just breathtaking news. And I want to take time to read from Freer's telegram to Frank Hecker, in which he relays his first news about his find. The telegram was composed on stationery from the Shepherd's Hotel and Gazeba Palace in Cairo on December 19th, 1906, and addressed to my dear Colonel. And I quote, since beginning this letter, I've closed the purchase of ancient manuscripts of exceeding interest. And this afternoon, I shall make drafts against my letter of credit for 1,600 British pounds, which together with two earlier drafts for 100 British pounds each makes the total to date 1,800 pounds. I fully intend to resist all temptations, but the manuscripts carried me completely off my feet. And after 2 days of examination, assisted by two Greek scholars, I fell by the wayside. As I wish to purchase to be kept quiet, private, and I trust you will not mention it outside. And for the next 12 months, only a small circle of scholars were aware of this discovery. And then about a year later, on December 30th, 1907, one such scholar, Henry Sanders, gave a lecture in Chicago about Freer's find at the annual meeting of the Archaeological Institute of America. The very next day, the New York Times carried an article that summarized his lecture. And here's the Times article, and we'll read how they presented the news to the general public. The headline reads, Finds Christ saying buried 1,300 years. Fragments of 16th chapter of Mark following 14th verse. Charles L. Freer owns it. The Detroit millionaire acquired it in Egypt in a competition with the British Museum. And it continues. Chicago, December 30th. A new saying of Christ, lost to the world for 13 centuries and found in Egypt, was given to the modern world for the first time today by Professor Henry A. Sanders of the University of Michigan in the course of an address to the members of the Archaeological Institute, now in session at the University of Chicago. Now we'll return to that, quote, new saying of Christ lost to the world, unquote, in due time. And here's how another newspaper of the day carried the news in enthusiastic terms. The Chicago Examiner, January 5th, 1908. Marvelous story of the discovery of an authentic manuscript of the Bible. Words of Christ, lost 1,300 years, are thus recovered and officially declared. Complete translation may compel revision of present-day Bible. Well, hyperbole aside, what is the truth about these manuscripts? The four manuscripts together are referred to as the Washington manuscripts since they're housed at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And I'm concentrating in this episode on just the Gospels manuscript, and it goes by various names. Codex Washingtonensis, or simply W. The Freer Gospel, the Freer Codex, or Codex Freerianus. It's designated by W or 032 in the Gregory Alan numbering scheme of New Testament manuscripts. And it's considered to be the third oldest gospel parchment codex in the world. The manuscript is a majuscule codex, which is precursor to the modern books, containing most of the texts of the four gospels written on 187 parchment leaves with painted wooden covers, which were added a few centuries later. Its leaves are roughly 8¼ inches tall by 5½ inches wide. The text is written in one column per page, 30 lines per page. The letters are written in small, slightly sloping, unsealed hand using dark brown ink. The words are written continuously in Greek without separation, a common practice the time we refer to as scriptio continua, a Latin phrase meaning continuous script. There are numerous corrections made by the original copyist and a few corrections dating to the late 5th or 6th century. The copyist has been generally described as generally a careful worker who produced extremely few nonsense readings and had very few other indicators of careless copying. And nomina sacra are also included throughout the text. Now, nomina sacra is a Latin phrase meaning sacred names. Certain names and words which were used in abundance in the New Testament were considered sacred and were abbreviated, usually with the first and last letter, and notified with a line above the abbreviation. Some examples would be the Greek word theos, theta sigma, kurios, kappa sigma, Christos, chi rho sigma, and Jesus, or Jesus in Greek, iota sigma. And there are others. And I'm showing now an example with 3 of these nomina sacra highlighted. It was a common feature and not unique to this manuscript. There are the usual additions and omissions when compared to the majority of other manuscripts, and here are just 2 examples. In Mark chapter 2, verse 3, the majority of manuscripts have, they came to him carrying a paralytic, being lifted up by 4 men. The freer codex doesn't indicate the number of men and simply has, behold, men came to him carrying a paralytic on a bed. In addition, in Luke 23, verse 34, the majority of manuscripts read, and Jesus said, Father, forgive them, they do not know what they do. The freer codex does not have this phrase, and I will leave a link in the description box to more variations. Now, there is a famous or infamous edition that immediately caught everyone by surprise, then and even now, if you've never known about it. It occurs at the end of Mark's Gospel and is known as the freer logion, logion meaning saying. Now, we've covered in a previous episode about several variations of the ending of Mark. The 2 most important are the traditional long ending and a shorter version ending at verse 8. But the freer codex has something no other known manuscript has. It's an addition of 16 lines of text, and it's a dialogue between the resurrected Jesus and his disciples that appears after Mark 16:14 and is unique among all manuscripts. The preceding verses, 12 and 13, read, After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. And what follows, beginning in verse 14 in the Freer Codex, is what is unique. And I quote, And they excused themselves, saying, This age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits. Therefore, reveal thy righteousness now. Thus they spoke to Christ. And Christ replied to them, The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was delivered over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, in order to inherit the spiritual and incorruptible glory of righteousness which is in heaven. Unquote. And it then continues with the rest of the long ending of Mark. Since it is unique to this codex, it is not considered the earliest form of the text, but it does beg the question, how did this passage end up in this manuscript? I'm showing you here the relevant passage in Greek from the codex itself. Now, several explanations have been put forth, but frankly, no one knows for sure how it wound up in this manuscript. Some scholars suggest that the Freer Logion originated as a liturgical or homiletic addition, a reflection or commentary added during public reading to the gospel in early Christian worship. Early Christian communities often adapted and expanded biblical text to address theological and pastoral concerns. Another possibility is that it began as a marginal note written by a scribe or reader of an earlier manuscript. And over time, as the manuscript was copied, the note may have been incorporated and found its way into the main text. Another option, it does reflect themes found in early Christian apocryphal literature. It may have been drawn from a non canonical source or an oral tradition that circulated in the early Christian community. And the emphasis on Satan's power and the need for repentance aligns with themes in early Christian apocalyptic literature, such as the Apocalypse of Peter or the Shepherd of Hermas. A scribe familiar with such traditions may have inserted the logion to, quote, enrich the text. Or perhaps it was an attempt to resolve the abrupt ending of Mark in a few early manuscripts. The abrupt ending was likely unsatisfying to some early Christians, leading to the addition of this longer ending. And the freer logion may represent a further attempt to complete or clarify the narrative by adding a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples that addresses the theological implications of the resurrection and the ongoing struggle against evil. Then again, the Phreologion may reflect a regional tradition unique to a certain community where the codex was produced. Early Christian communities often had their own distinctive theological emphases and textual traditions, and its inclusion in this manuscript, but not in others, suggests it may have been part of a local tradition that was not widely adopted elsewhere. Frankly, all of these explanations are mere speculation. We may never know for certain how it wound up in this manuscript. But here are some takeaways from the Freer Gospel Codex. The order of the Gospels in this codex is what we call the Western order found in some other manuscripts: Matthew, John, Luke, and then Mark, as opposed to our what we commonly know now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as is the case with the Bede collection and some others, we do not know the precise origin of this manuscript. Its provenance is somewhat complicated, but the best explanation may be that it originated from the city of Akhmim, which is ancient Panopolis, a city in southern or upper Egypt. Brent Nongbre, in his book, God's Library, opens with a discussion of the Freer Codex and its provenance, and I will link to that book in our description. Again, dating the Freer Codex involved a somewhat broad range based on handwriting style or paleography. Current consensus among scholars is that the Freer Codex dates to the late 4th or early 5th century. This dating is supported by a combination of paleographical, codicological, and textual evidence, as well as comparisons with other manuscripts from the same period. To my knowledge, no radiocarbon testing has ever been performed, although it has been suggested. Early scholars who have studied the Codex, and you can refer to their works, would include Henry Sanders, who kind of broke the news to the scholarly world, Caspar René Gregory, Bernard Grinfeld, we have an episode on him, Frederick Kenyon, F.C. Burkitt, E.J. Goodspeed, and B.H. Streeter. A list of modern scholars who have addressed the Codex would include Bruce Metzger, Bart Ehrman, Kent Clark, not Clark Kent, Larry Hurtado, Eldon J. Epp, David Parker, Michael Holmes, Jennifer Nust and Tommy Wasserman, James Elliott, and Daniel Wallace. And I'm confident we have not seen the last scholar turn his attention to serious study of this important manuscript. So to wrap up, the Freer Codex is not an oddity, but a significant piece of textual evidence that informs our understanding of the historical development of the New Testament text and early Christian beliefs. It's a rather complete text of the Gospels and allows us to study how its text compares with other early texts. And we focused in this episode on one rather controversial passage, but there's so much more to know about the Freer collection. Many links are provided in the description box for a deeper dive into those areas. Well, I think we're done for today. So I thank you for watching and contributing a discussion to this channel. I am considering starting a companion website where we can continue the conversation about topics raised in our channel. And I'm wondering if you think this is a worthy idea. Please let me know in your comments. So if you do like what you see and hear here, please like, subscribe, and share the channel with your friends. Our next episode will feature another manuscript collector. The initials are MB. No, it's not Milton Bradley. And I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. So stay tuned for that episode. So be well and peace out from the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.